This video is sponsored by Skillshare. One of my most requested videos on this channel is, time and time again, how do I grade my photos? If you've been following my channel or my work for even a little while, then you'll know that whilst I shoot a lot of my work on film, I also shoot a lot of work digitally. This is for a number of reasons. One being the cost of film is frankly too expensive to shoot all the time for me. Another reason is that I work with a lot of clients who need the photos back pretty much straight away. We do a lot of live editing in the kind of work that I do, which means turn around on the night, on the day, or the next morning. And of course, film photography just doesn't kind of fit into that workflow. But something that I've tried to do over the years is to maintain some sort of consistency between the way that I edit my digital photography and my film photography. This is so that the output of both mediums don't look largely that different, and I can move seamlessly between shooting on film and shooting digitally. So it's not necessarily that I try to edit my digital photos to look like film, but more that I try to create a sense of consistency so that it doesn't look too different. In today's video, we're going to be looking at a variety of film photos, both scans and handprints, to study the qualities of the film, before diving into Adobe Lightroom to look at how we can try to emulate some of these characteristics digitally. So we're going to be breaking this down into two sections. We're going to be looking at scans of different film stocks. So that is something to really keep in mind, that every film stock has different characteristics, different ways of producing color, different grain structures. Every film looks different. That's why we shoot different film stocks. When we're done looking at the scans, we're going to move on to looking at handprints and scans of handprints and how those differ. So I've selected a range of different film scans from over the years, most of which are medium format, and we're going to be having a look at the characteristics of these film stocks. So the first photo that I've got here is this photo of Curtis. This is one of my favorite film scans that I have for portrait photography, and I think that this photo in particular shows some of the characteristics really clearly. For example, we can see the lack of contrast. So if we think of contrast as the correlation between the dark point and the light part of an image, a lot of film doesn't provide that much contrast, or rather you can kind of see the steps between the dark and the light a lot more clearly than with digital photography. So for example, if we have a look at his hat, you can see the highlights on the top of the hat where the light is hitting, and then the shadow towards the bottom. But you can also see all the kind of steps in between that. I do find that this level of detail and color spectrum is quite specific to film, and that is often what a lot of people are looking for when they're trying to emulate the colors of film, is that same kind of tonal range. If you look at the blacks being slightly crushed, and when we say crushed, there's a little bit less detail. So if we go into these shadows, you see that we are losing the detail in the shadows. And this kind of crushed black, which often is referred to as like a faded black, was really popular back in like VSCO days, VSCO days, Tumblr days, when people were trying to emulate film by fading their blacks. But with the crushed blacks also come the crushed highlights. So we can see that the detail in the highlights is the same. It's not necessarily as bright as you might expect. And the way that the dark points and the light parts of this image are crushed creates kind of like a creamier texture. If we look at this photo of Flowdown, you can see the same thing. We have this creaminess in the highlights, and we also have this creaminess in the shadows. Again, in this photo of Leanne, you can see in the areas where there's a lot of shadow or things are underexposed, there's a lack of detail. If we take this photo of Neil that I shot last year, another thing that we can see when it comes to underexposure is a shift in color. So for example, here you can really see in the shadows that there is a shift towards green. This is also really common in film for film stocks to shift green or magenta depending on the lighting scenario. One of the common things that all of these scans have in common is that kind of creamy texture within the colors, where you have that full tonal range that creates a really soft image. Looking at this photo of Gerard, which is a scan of Cinestill 800T. So Cinestill 800T is tungsten light balanced, so it's a lot colder than all of the other film stocks that we looked at, which were daylight balanced, and you can really see that within this image. So what is it in this image that makes it look like film if you don't have those creamy warm tones that the other photos have. The grain in this image is particularly prominent, and this kind of grain is something that we often associate with film. Although you can get finer grain films like Ektar 100, film is often associated with this thick grain. And even though we don't have that creamy, warm feeling to this image, you still have the characteristics such as the muddy shadows down at the bottom where we're losing detail in Gerard's trousers. And you also have the detail in the color on the fur jacket. We can see the entire tonal range. You don't have really harsh highlights and really dark shadows. It's a lot more gradual and a lot less contrasty. Now we're taking a look at some film scans. Let's take a look at some handprints and some scans of these handprints as well. So handprinting film refers to printing film in the darkroom where you make prints from your negatives. This print in particular is one of my favorites that we shot for an editorial for Sean magazine early last year. As with the film scans, another thing that you really have when it comes to handprints is this same tonal range. If anything, it's even more prominent. So we have something called pre-flashing in darkroom printing where you can pre-flash the paper, pre-expose the paper with a color. So I've done it here with this cream, and this fills in the highlights that you can see kind of on his skin, etc., with a base level, which then softens those highlights and helps to create that more gradual tonal range, even in strong highlights. This is an example of a pre-flash test. You can see my handprint faintly. This is glossy paper, so you might not be able to see it that well, but you can faintly see there the line of my handprint. My hand is covering the paper during the pre-flash, so we can see what it does to the highlights pre-flash and post pre-flash. So before the pre-flash, you can see that this highlight here on his arm is considerably brighter, whereas further down his arm, it looks a little bit softer because we filled that in with a base level of color. This is another example of a pre-flash where you can see my hand here. Again, we're introducing kind of like a yellow base, which helps to blend out these highlights. But let's take a look at some other prints. This print is one of my favorite darkroom prints. These are all the different variations that I had when I was printing. Again, you can see that the key characteristics are this soft tonal range, and you also have a lot of brown shadows in here. So this is because I was printing quite warm, I was adding quite a lot of yellow to the image. You get that brownness in the muddiness of the shadows. These photos were actually underexposed in the shadows. So you can see here the muddiness in the background, the real brown hues throughout the image, and the same in this one. Looking at this photo, which I shot on 35mm Cinestill, this is one of my favorite handprints as well. That lack of detail in the background is a characteristic of underexposed film. It doesn't hold detail in the shadows as well as digital photography. And this shot is also just a strip of a wider print, but you can see the brightness in the reds, the coldness in the blue, and the gravel. The Cinestill 800T, which is tungsten light balance, but we shot it outside, so it's a lot colder, but we can get this pop of red. These are just colors that don't naturally come from a digital camera, so you would need to emulate that digitally. Let's have a look at some scans of handprints to have a little bit of a closer look. So this is the scan of the print that we just looked at, and this is one of my favorites. I think it was actually a different variation of the print where I had a little bit more exposure time to try and lift some of the shadows a little bit, but still the way that the top of Dan's head kind of blends into that shadow and that lack of detail is of course very reminiscent of film. Well, it is film, so that's why. And again, the brightness of the red in his shirt, the brightness on the yellow, the fact that this yellow has such depth to it. It has all these different increments of yellow throughout that kind of strip. I think that really is a key point in handprints, is that kind of tonal range, that range of color that is apparent and that is so rich compared to digital photography straight from camera. Taking the time to study and learn your craft is really an instrumental part of developing your practice as a photographer, whether it's in color grading or something different, like maybe studio lighting or lighting in general. You know, analyzing your photos, analyzing the photos of other people's, studying it and noticing kind of commonalities, characteristics is one of the best ways to develop your craft. And this leads me really nicely onto the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. So I've been using Skillshare for a number of years, both as a student and also as a teacher, diving into classes about film photography, about photography just in general, and just generally being a creative. If you don't already know about Skillshare, Skillshare is the largest online community for creatives. You can access thousands of different classes from hundreds of creators across different topics, from photography to freelancing to filmmaking, illustration, you name it. It's really centered around the learning experience. The classes each encourage you to act on what you've learned, creating class projects and diving into discussions with fellow students and teachers to help grow your creative skills, to look at other people's work, to get feedback and really be a part of a creative community. They also have this feature called Learning Paths, where you can access curated sequential playlists of classes that focus around a specific skill or topic. So let's say you're really interested in starting your own business, for example. Well, there's a learning path curated exactly for that. Or maybe you're interested in becoming a freelance video editor, then there's one for you too. Last week, I launched a brand new class of my own with Skillshare, and it is all about editing portrait photography. We deep dive into Adobe Lightroom Classic and look at the tools available to enhance your portrait photography. So if you'd like to access my brand new class alongside all of my other classes, from classes about studio photography, about color theory, and also classes from, hundreds of other brilliant creators, then the first 500 people to click the link in the description will receive a free 1-month trial of Skillshare. So get started today. And now within this video, we are going to jump into Adobe Lightroom ourselves, and we're going to look at some of the tools you can use to help emulate film within your digital photography. Okay, so we have Lightroom open, and I have a few different photos that we're going to look at and just apply or show you how some of the tools in Lightroom can be used to try to emulate some of the characteristics that we've explored. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the idea of crushed blacks and crushed highlights. So to do this, we're going to come into our tone curve, which is this section here in the Develop tab. Let me close all this down and make it a bit easier to see. So the way that a tone curve works, so that the bottom left corner is going to affect the darkest part of your image, and the top right is going to affect the lightest part of your image. So I'm going to add some little points onto this so that we don't end up moving the whole line. And if I bring this up, you can see that we are losing detail in the darkest parts of the image. If I bring it across, you can see that that is getting darker. This black point is getting more black. If we do the same with the highlight point up here, if we bring it this way, you can see that these highlights here are getting brighter. If you push it down, you can see that they're getting flatter. So when we were looking at the film photos, the thing that we noticed was that most of the shadows were crushed a bit. We had a lack of detail in this section. So I'm going to bring that part up, and then this section here I'm going to bring down so that there is less detail in the dark parts of the image. For the highlights, I'm going to bring this bit down and try to bridge the gap between this really strong highlight and then these highlights here, like so. You can also really reduce the contrast just using your contrast tool, and then bring contrast back in using your tone curve. So this is what we call an S-curve. It's really common within a lot of people who edit in Lightroom to use an S-curve to achieve this kind of contrast. So I'm just going to play around with where these points are and get the kind of least contrast running through the image. And then I'm obviously just going to bring the exposure up a bit. I'm also going to flatten the whites here, but bring the highlights up. If I bring the whites up, you can see that it's really contrasty, whereas the highlights are just kind of a little bit softer. And bring the shadows up a little bit until I get something I like. Bring the darks down, the blacks down. Cool, I'm kind of happy with that. So the next thing we're going to look at is the idea of a pre-flash. So that's introducing kind of a base color. And we're going to do that by looking at the color grading section. So with your color grading section, you have these 3 circles, one that controls the color of the midtones, one that controls the shadows, one that controls the highlights. So if I add something to the midtones, that is going to be something that kind of adds a global color wash onto the image. And I'm gonna go for something kind of like yellowy, because if I was in the dark room, I would put kind of a warm pre-flash underneath this image. Strengthen it a little bit. And then when it comes to highlights and shadows, let's take a look. For the highlights, I'd probably add something a little bit like a yellow again, just to complement that midtones. And then for the shadows, I guess I'd add kind of like this, yeah, like an orangey kind of color. Remember the image that we shot of Isa outside that I hand printed, that was like really heavy with the brown undertones in the shadows. So we're gonna go for something like that. The next thing I do is just add a little bit of artificial grain. So where's our grain? Okay, so when it comes to the grain, I'm not gonna go overkill. I'm gonna put it all the way up just to show you what it looks like. So this is like your grain. Obviously it's digital grain. It doesn't look quite the same as film grain. And then you can affect the size of the grain and the roughness. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have like a really small amount of grain. I'm not gonna put too much on, but it's gonna be larger grain. And let's have a look at, the roughness is kind of like your contrast, like almost like the strength of the grain. I think kind of that's fine. Maybe bring the grain size up a bit. I'll increase the amount a bit and just kind of fine tune it. Yeah, keep it larger. I'm kind of happy with that. I'm going to decrease the contrast even more and just fine tune now with the temperature tools. Add a bit more magenta. And then I'm quite happy with that as an example of maybe something that would emulate film or look consistent alongside my film work. Let's take a look at another image that is very different. So for this photo, let's have a look. Let's start with a little curve again. I'm gonna add some warmth to the image. It's a bit cold for me. And flatten those whites again. Already we're getting somewhere. Decrease the contrast. I'm gonna add some like green into the shadows. You remember we were saying about when film's underexposed, it looks kind of green. Also, a characteristic of something like Fuji Pro 400 is that it's quite a green film stock. Then in the highlights, let's add a little, maybe like a contrasting red and orange. There we go. Then for this one now, I'd probably just increase the saturation a little bit. And that already, very simply, I would say, would sit well within some of my film photography. So what we've looked at here is we've looked at the different characteristics of film photography. And we've looked at the fact that a lot of film is very low contrast, has slight shifts of color in the highlights and the shadows depending on how you've exposed the image, whether or not you've printed the image in a pre-flash. And of course, we've looked at things like grain structure. There are a lot of reasons why you might want to try to emulate film within your digital work. For me, as I said, it's a consistency thing so that my two libraries of images don't look too dissimilar. But I'd recommend that you just jump into whatever editing software you like to use most and play around. If you do shoot film, then reference film photos that you've taken before. That can be especially useful if you've taken film on a shoot and digital on a shoot, because you can try to match those colors. If you don't shoot film, then maybe look at the work of other people's that you like and study their kind of film photography and look at the characteristics that kind of draw you towards that look. Thank you guys for tuning in to today's video. It's been a while since I did an editing video, so it's been nice to jump into Lightroom and walk you guys through my process. If you want to see my full process for portrait photography, then of course you can do so by accessing my Skillshare class. And a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. A reminder that if you want to get your hands on my class and tons of other classes on Skillshare, then you can click the link in the description. And the first 500 of you to do so will get a free 1 month trial of Skillshare. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.